In this Blender tutorial, I will show you how to create these 3 procedural desert rock materials. Now, if I were to create all of these 3 procedural materials in one video, that would be a very long video, so I've decided to break this up into 2 parts. So in this part, in part 1, we're going to be doing all the 3D setup, and then we're going to be creating the first procedural desert rock material. And then in part 2, we're going to be creating the other 2 procedural rock materials. So if you want to set up the Blender file the same way that I have, then you can watch the starting of this video where I do all the 3D setup, and then you can either create all 3 procedural rock materials, or you can just create whichever one you want to make. So here is the first procedural desert rock material, and we'll be creating this one in this video. And after we create the material, I'll show you how to join it together into this custom node group. So for this first material, we have the overall scale, and this will change the size of the entire material. And then we also have these different custom colors. And then we also have this color here, and this is going to be the colors of those little stripes which are going back and forth. Then we also just have the noise scale, and we also have the stripe scale. And then we also have the texture detail, so you can choose how much detail you want to use. And then we also have a second layer of detail, so if I turn this up, you can see it looks very detailed and bumpy. And then we also have the roughness of the material, and we also have the bump strengths, and then finally the displacement strength. And then in part 2 of this tutorial, we'll be creating the 2 other rock materials. So here's the second one. So we have the overall scale, and then also we have the different colors, so colors 1 through 4. And then we also have the noise scale, so I can make that noise bigger or smaller. And we also have the chunk scale, so you can see this variation of the desert rock is kind of chunky, so you can turn this up and down. And then we also have noise detail 1, and we have noise detail 2, so if you want it to be more detailed, you can turn that up. And then we also have this cool distortion value. Then we also have the roughness of the material. We also have the bump strengths, and then the displacement strength. And then we have the third desert rock material, so just like the other ones, we have the overall scale, and then we also have some custom colors, so colors 1, 2, and 3. Then we just have the noise scale, we just have the Voronoi scale, we just have the wave scale, and we also have the crack scale. Then we also have the texture detail, so you can turn the detail up and down, and then we have the roughness and the bump strength, and then finally the displacement strength. And if you'd like to purchase these procedural materials as well as help support me and this channel, then you can do that on my Gumroad store and my Patreon page with the links in the description. And you can also check out my Ultimate Blender Procedural Material Pack if you'd like to purchase all of my materials. And my Ultimate Procedural Material Pack comes with all of my procedural materials, and they're all pre-set up in Blender's asset browser with custom thumbnails, sorted catalogs, and they all have customizable node groups. And you can also check out my procedural material packs to purchase packs of 10 materials. And if you'd like to learn how to create any of my procedural materials, you can also check out my procedural material tutorial playlist here on YouTube. So I'm now going to be showing you the 3D setup if you want to set up the Blender file the same way that I have. And then as I mentioned earlier, if you want to learn how to create the first procedural material, that'll be in this video. And then to learn how to create the other 2 procedural materials, that'll be in the next part, which I'll be posting very soon. And the link to that will be in the description. So I'm going to press Shift A, and I'm going to go here to Mesh, and I'm going to add an icosphere because I want to preview this material on a sphere. Now I want this to be very subdivided because we want a lot of geometry that the displacements can use. So right behind me, if you click right there on the Add Icosphere settings, just open this up. I'm going to turn these subdivisions up to 6 so that there's lots of detail. And then I can use the Object Context menu and shade the object smooth. And then I want even more detail that the displacements can use. So I'm going to click here on the modifier properties, and I'm going to click on add modifier, and I'll add the subdivision surface. Now, so that it's not too laggy in the viewport, I'm going to turn the viewport levels just to 1, or if it is pretty laggy, you could turn the viewport levels to 0, and then you can turn the render levels up. So you could go with 2, I'm going to go all the way to 3, and this way the subdivision levels will just be at 1 in the viewport, but then when it actually renders the final material, it'll be all the way up at 3. But if this is taking too long to render or it's using too much memory, you could just keep the render down at 1 or 2. Now, as well as previewing the objects on a sphere, I also want to create a basic rock object to preview the materials on. So to add a basic rock object, I'll click on Edit and I'll go to the Preferences. And then you can click over here on Add-ons, and you can go over to the search and you can type in Extra. And you want to check mark the Add Mesh Extra Objects add-on. So it's built into Blender, and I'll show you how to use it in the video. And then you can close Blender's user preferences. So now that we have the extra objects add-on enabled, you can press Shift A and you can go to Mesh, and then you can go right down here and you can see there is a rock generator. So I'm going to click on this to add a rock, and you can see it's inside this object, so we can zoom in here just to kind of see it, or you can also go into wireframe to see the shape of the rock. Now you can see right over here on the add rock settings, there is this use a random seed. So I'm going to turn this off, and then I can click here to change the seed. And you can change this to round to whatever rock that you want to use. I think that is a pretty nice rock. So then I can just close the add rock settings. So I can now press G to grab, and I can move this rock over, and I'll hold down the Z button and go back to solid view. Now I want to make this rock look more detailed, and so if you click right over here on the modifier properties, you can see that the rock generator has added all of these modifiers. So what I'm going to do is turn the levels viewport up to 3 on the subsurf, and also on the second subsurf I'll also turn this up to 3. So now you can see the rock is very detailed. Then what I'm going to do is hover my mouse over the modifiers, and you can press Control A, that is going to apply the modifiers, and I'm just going to continue to hover my mouse over the top modifier and press Control A, and I'm going to do that again and again until all the modifiers are applied. So now if I hit the tab key to go into edit mode, you can see all the modifiers have been applied, and so it's actual geometry now. Now if I go back to solid view, you can see there are some sharp edges, so I will tab into edit mode. I'll press the A key to select the entire rock, and I'm going to press the N key to open up the side panel. And then I'll click right over here on the item tab. And right down here on the edges data, you can see that there's this mean crease, and I'm going to turn the mean crease all the way to 0, and that way there aren't any of those red edges. So I can hit the tab key to go back to solid view. So now what I can do is just use the object context menu and shade the object smooth, and it's going to smooth out those edges. And I'll press the N key to close that side panel, and I can move this over here. So now what I can do is select the object, I'll go back into edit mode, and I can rotate the entire rock. I can also double tap the R key to trackball rotate the rock, and I'm going to bring it over here. And then if you press the O key is going to turn on the proportional editing, and you can select some parts of the rock, and you can press G to grab, and then you can scroll with your mouse wheel to make the proportional editing bigger or smaller, and you can just change the shape of the rock. But something like that is pretty good. So you can just move around the rock to change the shape. So now in object mode, I want this rock to be about the same size as the sphere. So I'll just scale the rock up, kind of bring it over here so that it is the same size. And I'm going to put this rock right up here above the sphere. And I can also just rotate over to the side. Now when modeling to the real life scale in Blender, the default primitive objects are a little bit higher than an average human. So this rock is actually like a giant boulder. So I'm going to select both of these objects at once, and then I'll hit S to scale. And I'm going to type in 0.2 and then enter. So they are much smaller, and I can just bring them down here. Then what I want to do is press Control A with the object selected, and I want to apply the rotation and scale. So this is now the object's new default rotation and scale. And these objects are a little bit high poly, so it is a little bit laggy in the viewport. So if you want to, you can select the icosphere, and you can turn the levels viewport just to like 0, and I might turn the render down to 2. So now I want to add the same subdivision surface modifier to this object as well, because I want this object to have more detail that the displacements can use. So I'm going to select the rock object, I'll click on add modifier, and I'm going to add the subdivision surface. And then you can turn it to the same numbers, so maybe I'll have it render at 2, but then the levels viewport I can turn it down to 0 so it's not too laggy in the viewport. So I'm now going to select both of these objects, and because I'm creating 3 different rock materials, I want to duplicate these 2 times. So I'll press Shift D to duplicate, I can bring this over here, and then Shift D to duplicate, and I can just bring that over there. So now we can preview the 3 different materials on a sphere and a rock. And then to add a camera, you can press Shift A, you can go right down here and add a camera, and then you can move your view to wherever you want the camera to be, and you can press Control Alt Numpad 0, and that is going to bring the camera to wherever you are. And then you can just kind of move the camera around and position it where you want. And then I will hold down the Z button and go up into the rendered view. Now for the lighting, I added this area light right here, so you can press Shift A, you can go down to light and you can add an area light, and I just pointed it on the side of the objects. And if you click over here to go to the object data properties, I turned the power up to 12, and then I also made the color a slight orangey color. And that way we have that nice orange light shining on the side of the objects. And then to get some nice realistic lighting and reflections, over here on the world properties, I added in this HDRI from polyhaven.com. I'll have a link in the description if you'd like to download it. And I downloaded the 1K HDR version. So once you download the HDRI, you can click on the yellow dot next to color, and you can choose environment texture, and then you can click on the open button and open up the HDRI. And I turned the strength of the HDRI down to 0.7 so it wasn't quite as bright. Now, if you want to make the background transparent so you can't see the HDRI, then you can click right here on the render properties, and you can open up the film tab, and you can check mark the transparent button. The HDRI will still light the scene, but you can't see it in the background. And then also here on the render engine, I'm going to be using the Cycles rendering engine because I am going for realism, and I'm also using the material displacements, and the Eevee rendering engine doesn't support material displacements. So if you want to use the displacements, make sure you're using Cycles. And then to make the lighting look a bit nicer, I'm going to go here to the color management, and I'm going to use the view transform of filmic, and I'll use the look of high contrast. And then you can click right over here on the shading workspace, and on the shading workspace I have the 3D viewport right over here, and I'm in the rendered mode, and then there's also the shader editor right over here. So you can zoom into the first object or whichever object you want to add the material to, and let's click on this object here. I'll click on new to add a new material, and I can click and drag and I can drop the material onto this object as well, and that way they both have the same material. Now to make sure the displacements will work on this material, you want to click over here on the material properties, and on this material you want to go to the settings surface, and here on the displacement setting you want to change the bump only to displacement and bump, and this is telling this material that it can use the displacements. And then also I will be using the Node Wrangler add-on in this tutorial to preview the different nodes, so if you don't have the Node Wrangler enabled, you can click on edit and you can go to the preferences, and then right over there on the add-ons tab just search for Node Wrangler, and you can check mark the Node Wrangler add-on, and I'll show you how to use it in the video. Alright, so let's create the first desert rock material. So I'm just going to rename this material right up here to Desert Rock 1. So I'm going to start by pressing Shift A, and I'll go here to the search, and I'm going to search for a noise texture. Let's drop the noise texture down here, and then using the feature of the Node Wrangler add-on, I'm going to hold down the Control and Shift key and select the noise texture to preview it. And then also with the noise texture selected, I'll press Control T, and that is going to add the texture coordinate and mapping nodes. And then I want to use the object coordinates, so let's put the object into the vector, and the object coordinates will place the texture on the object more evenly. So now let's change some of the noise texture settings. So I'm going to turn the scale up to like a 16. I also want it to be very detailed, so I'll turn the detail all the way to the max of 15. And then I actually want to turn the roughness down a little bit so that it's a little bit more smooth. So I'm going to turn the roughness to a 0.45. Now I want to squish down the noise texture a little bit on the Z-axis so it looks more like desert rock. So I'm going to click on this mapping node, I'll press Shift D to duplicate it and drop it here after the first one. So the first mapping node will be used to change the entire scale of the material, but then we can use the second mapping node to squish down the texture. So right here we have the scale Z, and I'm going to turn the scale Z to a value of 2, and that way it'll squish it down a bit, and you can see now there's that nice pattern, and it looks like it's going back and forth a bit more. So I now want to take this noise texture, and I'm going to put the factor into the base color, and I'll Control Shift and select the principal shader. Now you can see that just looks white and black, and so I want to change the colors. So I'll press Shift A, let's go to the search, and I can search for the mix node. Let's drop it here, and I want to change the float to color instead. And we can put the mix node in between the noise and the principal. And I want the noise texture to be going into the factor, and the factor is determining where it's going to be color A and where it's going to be color B on the object. So now we can make the colors for A and B. So here on color A, I want to make this kind of an orangish peachy color for the desert rock. So I'm going to make it pretty bright and kind of an orangey color. And if you want to use the same exact color that I'm using, you can go over to the hex value and you can punch in EB, 8E, 4A. So that's the exact color that I'll be using for color A. And then here on color B, I also want to make this a brownish color. So we're going to make it kind of orange. Then we're going to make it a bit darker, but I want this to be kind of a reddish brown. So we're going to bring it over towards the red. And the hex value I'm using for color B is going to be 4D, 1D, 13. Now I also want to put this noise texture into the roughness so that some parts are more rough and other parts are more shiny. So let's take the noise texture factor, I'm going to put that into the roughness, but then I want to control those colors. So I'll press Shift A, I'll go to the search, and I'll search for a color ramp, and let's stick this between the noise texture and the principled. So if we make the colors lighter, they're going to be more rough. So what I first want to do is actually switch these values. So I'm going to drag the white tab over here, and the black tab I'm going to drag over here. But then I'm going to click on the black tab and click on the color, and I'm going to make this a very light gray, and you can now see it looks much more like a dry, rough rock. And on the color ramp tab, this light gray color is going to be a hex value of C6, C6, C6. Now later on, when we join this into a custom node group, I want to be able to control the roughness. So I'll press Shift A, I'll go to the search, and I'll search for the hue saturation value, and let's put that in between the color ramp and the principled. So on the hue saturation value, we have this value right here. And so this, if I drag this around, it's going to make it lighter or darker, and that'll control how rough or shiny it is. So we can use that value later in the custom node group. Now I also want to put this into the bump, so let's take the noise texture factor. I want to put that into the normal to give it some surface bump, but you can see there's some weird shading issues, and that's because we need to convert the black and white data into normal data. So I'll press Shift A, I'll go to the search, and I'll search for the bump node, and let's put that in between the noise texture and the principled. And then I want the noise texture factor to be going into the height value. And now you can see it looks very bumpy, but I actually want to turn the strength way down, so I'll just turn the strength to like a 0.1. And now it's only a little bit bumpy, and we will be making it more bumpy, but we'll be adding this noise texture into the displacement, and that'll make it look much more bumpy. So I'm going to take the noise texture factor and let's stick this into the displacement, but then just like with this bump here, we need to convert the black and white data into displacement data. So I'll press Shift A, I'll go to the search, I'll search for the displacement node, and let's drop this in between the noise texture and the displacement on the material output. And I'm going to drag it right down here so the wires are not overlapping. And I'm also going to hold down the Shift key and right click and drag over this wire and then let go. And this is going to add a reroute, and I'm going to drag the reroute over here. And this way it'll just organize the nodes a little bit better, so they're not overlapping quite as much. Now to make the displacement work properly, we actually want the noise texture factor to be going into the height value of the displacement. And now you can see it is popping out. Now if for some reason the displacement isn't working, then you need to click right over here on the material properties, and you need to go to the settings surface, and right here on the displacement on this material, you need to make sure this is set to displacement and bump, and this way you're telling the material that it can use the displacements. And also make sure that you are using the cycles rendering engine right up here on the render properties, because Eevee doesn't support material displacements, so make sure you're using cycles. So I'm going to close this properties panel. Now it's way too bumpy, so we need to make it less strong. So here on the scale, I'm just going to turn this way down, and I'll turn this to like a 0.06, so it's not quite as strong. Now I want to change the shape of the displacement, because right now you can see it is very bumpy, but I want it to be a little bit more smooth and kind of have some chunks which are popping out. So I'm going to press Shift A, I'm going to go to the search, and I'm going to search for the RGB curves, and let's drop the RGB curves right down here. And then what I'm going to do is hold down the Shift key, and I'm going to right click and drag over these three wires, and then let go. And what it's going to do is it's going to add this reroute right here, and so these three wires was going into the color ramp, and the bump, and the displacement. But we're not going to connect this into the wire which is going into the mix. So just the roughness with the color ramp, and the bump here, and the displacement. So now that we have this extra reroute here, I can click and drag to box select these nodes, and I'm going to bring them back, and we can now take the RGB curves, and we're going to stick that in between the noise texture and the reroute. So now the RGB curves is going through the wire, and that'll affect the roughness and the bump and the displacement. So we can use this RGB curves to change the shape of the displacement. So what I'm going to do is click and drag right here to add a dot, and I'm going to drag this dot kind of down here. Then I'm going to click here to add another dot, and I'm going to drag this up here, and you can see it's changing the shape of the displacement. So I'll just drag this to about there. Then I'm going to click right here to add another dot. I'm going to drag this over here, and then I'm going to click to add another dot and drag this down. And you can see what this is doing. So basically this RGB curve shape here is going to be the shape of the displacement. If I click to add another dot here and then drag it down, you can see now there's parts here which are going to dip down. I'm going to click on the center dot here and then hit the X to get rid of it. And I can just kind of play around with this because I want to shape it a little bit better. And so because we have this flatter area right here, if you zoom in to the material, you can see that some parts go back in and they're a bit more noisy and bumpy, and there's other parts here which come out a bit and they're a bit more flat. And so that makes the texture look much more interesting. Now, if I zoom into this rock here, you can see there are some places where the mesh is kind of overlapping. You can see there's like a little crease here, and there's also some little dark areas there. And this is because of the displacement mid-level. So it's displacing the mesh, and so it's popping out the vertices, but what it's doing is it's actually overlapping the geometry. If I turn this up more and more, you can see it start to overlapping more. So what I'm going to do to fix this is to just change the mid-level. So I'm going to turn the mid-level up to like a 0.7, and now you can see the vertices aren't overlapping. So if I turn the mid-level down, you can see now they're going to like get too small and go into each other, or if I make this too big, it's going to get kind of puffy and then overlap. So you can just find something that works well for your object. For me, a 0.7 looks good, and that way there isn't any overlap. So now I want to add another noise texture, and we're going to make some little cracks going along the surface. So I'll press Shift A, I'll go to the search, and I'll search for another noise texture, and let's drop this down here. And then I want to click and drag and just box select these nodes. So the first mapping and the texture coordinate, I'm going to drag them down, and then I want to take this first mapping, and let's put the vector into the vector, the noise texture. And I can Control Shift and select the noise texture to preview it. And then let's also click on this mapping, and I'll press Shift D to duplicate it, and I'm going to drop it down here so that this mapping is also stretching this noise texture. Although for this mapping, I want to stretch it even more because I just want to make this look like there are some little stripes going back and forth. So here on the scale Z, I'm going to turn this to a value of 10, and that way it is stretched much more. So you can see there's that nice texture. So then let's also change some of the noise texture settings. So I'm going to turn the scale to like a 13 so it is smaller. Also turn the detail all the way up to 15, and I do want it to be very detailed, so I'll also turn the roughness to a 0.8. And I do also want a little bit of distortion, so I'll turn the distortion to like a 0.4. So you can see we now have this very detailed stretched noise texture. Now I don't want to be able to see the stripes all over the place, I just want to be able to see some of the stripes. So I'm going to click on this color ramp, I'll press Shift D to duplicate it and drop it here, and then with the color ramp selected, I can hit the backspace, and that is going to reset the color ramp. And then I can drop it here into the noise texture, and we are previewing it, so you can Control Shift and select the color ramp to preview it. And I'm going to drop it right down here under the RGB curves, so this noise texture factor is going into the color ramp. So we can now use this color ramp to make it more contrasty. So what I'm first going to do is click on this black tab here and click on the color, and I'm going to make this a much lighter gray because I do want it to be very subtle. And the hex value that I'm using for this light gray is going to be A6, A6, A6. Then I'm going to click on the white tab and I'm going to drag this over, and you can see as I drag it over, it's going to be more contrasty. So I'm going to drag the white tab to about there. Then I'm going to hold down the Control key and click to add another tab right here. And this one, I'm going to make the same gray color. So if I go to the hex value, I'm going to type in A6, A6, A6. Then I'll hold down the Control key and click here to add another tab. And this one, I'm going to make it fully white again. And you can now see, because we're going in between gray and white, you can just see some of those little stripes here and there. I'm going to do it one more time, so I'll hold down the Control key, click about here, maybe drag it over, and then I can hold down the Control key and click again to add another tab, and this one I'll drag a bit closer, and then I'm going to click here on this color, and this one again I'm going to change the same value, so A6, A6, A6. And you can drag it around if you want to make it more contrasty. So if you want more of it, you can drag it over here, or less of it, you can drag that back. But something like that looks pretty good. So I now want to mix this into the color and also the bump. So what I'm going to do is go right up here and I'll click on this mix and I'll press Shift D to duplicate it, and I'm going to drop it here after the first one. So I'm now going to take this color ramp and I'm going to put the color into the factor of the mix. And I can Control Shift and select the mix to preview it. Now you can see right now where those little stripes are, it's actually lighter and then the rest of it is dark, but I want to flip the values. So let's take the result from this mix here and we're going to put that into the bottom one, so color B. Then here, color A, that is going to be those different stripe colors. So I'm going to click on this and I'm going to make it a pretty dark color, and I'm going to make it kind of like a reddish brown. And the hex value that I'll be using for color A is going to be a hex value of 3D 160D. So I can now Control Shift and select the principled shader to preview it. Now I also want to put those stripes into the normal to give it some bump. So let's click on the bump node. I'll press Shift D to duplicate it, and I'm going to drop it here after the first one. So the normal from this bump can go into the normal of the other bump. So we now have this extra height value that we can add data into. So let's take the color ramp color, and I'm going to put that into the height value. And now if you zoom in, you can see it is just a little bit bumpy, but I do want to make it a bit more strong. So if we turn this up, now you can see it's more strong. I'm going to turn the strength to just like a 0.3. So now you can see where those little stripes are. It is just a little bit more bumpy. And there is the first desert rock material. So I'm now going to join this together into a custom node group. So let's first click and drag to box select all the nodes except the material output. And I can press Ctrl G, that will join it together into a node group. And then you can press the Tab key to go in and out of the node group. So I'm going to drag the material output here. I can zoom in. I can also drag the node group out to make it bigger, drag it over here. And I want to use the same name as the material name. So I'll click on the desert rock, press Ctrl C to copy the name, click here, and press Ctrl V to paste the name. And then if you select the node group, you can hit the Tab key to go into the node group. I'll press the N key. That's going to open up the side panel, and you can click here on the group tab. And then there's going to be inputs and outputs. Now here on the outputs, I want to double click on this, and I'm going to rename it to shader because I like that a bit better. So now we can add all of the different customizable values. So let's click on this group input node, and I'm going to drag it down here. And I first want to take the mapping scale, and I'm going to put that into the group input because this mapping scale is connected to all the textures. So we can scale this and it'll scale the entire size of the material. Now if we click on the scale here, I want this to be one single value instead of 3 values. You can see right now it's 3 values. So let's click on the type here, and I'm going to change it to float instead, so it is 1 value. And then here on the default, I want to change this to 1, so the default value is 1. And then if I hit the Tab key to go out of the node group, we need to turn the scale back to 1. So now you can see the texture, but I can use this to change the entire size of the material. So let's hit the Tab key to go back into the node group. So I now want to add the 3 custom colors. So I'm going to drag the group input right over here, and let's first take A, put that in there to the extra socket, and also B, put that there into the extra socket. And then outside of the node group, you'll be able to control those colors. So back into the node group, we can rename these. So I can rename this to color 1, and then this one here, I'm going to rename this to color 2. Now I also want to control the stripes color. So let's put this other one here into the extra socket. And then if I click on this to rename it, I can rename it to stripes color. Now I also want to be able to control the main noise texture scale. So let's drag the group input back here, and we can take the noise texture scale, this top noise texture, let's put the scale into the group input. And then I can click on this to rename it, and I'm going to rename it to noise scale. Then I want to be able to control the stripe scale. So this bottom texture down here, this bottom noise texture, that is controlling the scale of the stripes. So let's take the scale and put that into the extra socket, and I can double click on this, and I'm going to rename it to stripes scale. And then I want to be able to control the detail of the textures. So let's take the noise texture detail, let's put that into the extra socket, and I'm going to take the same detail from the other noise texture, and let's put that into the same socket. And this way, this one single value will control both details. And if I double click on this to rename it, I'm just going to call it texture detail. Now right here on the top noise texture, if we drag this roughness around, that is going to change how the material looks quite a bit. And so if we want to be a lot more coarse, we can kind of turn that up, or if we want to be more smooth, we can kind of turn that down. So let's take the roughness, and I can put that into the extra socket, and I can click on this to rename it, and I'm going to rename it to texture detail 2. Then I want to be able to control the roughness of the material. So let's take the group input, and I can drag it down here, and we can take this value from the hue saturation value, and let's put that into the extra socket, and then I can click on this to rename it, and I'll rename it to roughness. So that is going to make the color brighter or darker, and so that'll control the roughness of the material. And then I also want to be able to control the bump strength. So let's take the first strength, I can put that into the extra socket, and also the second strength, and I can put that into the extra socket. Now the top one here, if I double click on this to rename this one is controlling the noise. So I'm going to call this one noise bump strength. But then the second one here, this one is controlling the stripes bump strength. So if I double click on this to rename it, I'll rename it to stripes bump strength. And then finally, I want to be able to control the displacement. So let's drag the group input over here, and let's take the scale of the displacement, and I can put that into the group input. And then if I click on this to rename it, I can rename this to displacement strength. Alright, so I can click on the group input and I can just drag it back here. I'll drag it underneath the texture coordinate and I can hit the tab key to go outside of the node group. And there we go. So we now have all the different custom values. So we have the scale, we have the color of the rocks, we also have the noise scale, the stripe scale, and we have some details here, some texture details. We also have the roughness, and we have the bump strengths, and also the displacement strength. So that is it for the first desert rock material. So if I made all three materials in one video, that would be a very long video. So I'm going to be breaking this up into two parts. So when part 2 is released, it's going to be right up there on the end screen, and also I'll have the link in the description. And in part 2, we're going to be creating the 2 other desert rock materials. And if you'd like to help support this channel and purchase the materials, you can get that on my Gumroad store and my Patreon page with the links in the description. And you can also check out my ultimate procedural material pack if you'd like to purchase all of my materials. And if you'd like to learn how to create any of my procedural materials, then definitely check out my procedural material tutorial playlist here on YouTube with the link in the description. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next part.